Dispatch, this is Jody.
Yes, ma'am. I need to report my neighbor has been beat up. He's got some pretty significant bruises and things to his face.
Okay, your neighbor was beaten up at some point.
Yes, ma'am.
What is your name?
My name is Tabitha.
What's your neighbor's name?
There's a young man that he says done it. You just stay right there.
Are you still there? Tabitha? Tabitha?
A 911 call came in from Miss Tabitha Smith, who reported that her 91-year-old neighbor, Mr. Edward Vaughn, had been assaulted.
They dispatched a deputy to the scene. The deputy made contact with Tabitha Smith, who was also in the presence of Edward Vaughn. Edward Vaughn had lacerations to his face, bruising, swelling. He had blood coming out of his ears. Mr. Vaughn at that time was very lucid and of a clear mind and was able to easily recall what happened. Mr. Vaughn told the primary responding deputy that he actually made contact with two men earlier and that these individuals were interested in buying a vehicle that Mr. Vaughn had for sale. He said these individuals took Mr. Vaughn and basically abducted him, held him against his will, and put a blanket or some type of a carpet over him and drove him out in the county where they physically assaulted him.
He said they did zip tie his hands together and assaulted him, punched him, hit him in the head 2 or 3 times, and ultimately they had brought him back home.
At this point, Mr. Vaughn, being 91 years old, needed intense medical attention.
Ultimately, he was loaded up in the ambulance to go to the hospital.
The first time I met Edward Vaughn was with Mission Machine, the nonprofit, and I was just a volunteer driver at that time. Mission Machine's mission is to help homeless with a temporary place to stay, and he was just needing a place until he could get into an apartment. The happiest memory I've got of Mr. Vaughn is when he got his apartment here. He was just very happy about where he was at and very proud of what he had.
Mr. Vaughn didn't have a whole lot of money. He didn't have much for himself, but he had a very charitable soul to him. He would have helped just about anybody, I believe.
Mr. Vaughn was a World War II vet. He had got a Bronze Star. He was very proud of the fact that he had served his country.
He served me. He fought for me, my freedom, for all of us.
Everything that he had done in his life through war, through the many years after, he had always been a survivor. He knew what he needed to do, and he knew how to survive.
Miss Smith said that she noticed when she left that morning at about 6:30 that Mr. Vaughn's car was gone. When Miss Smith came back about 8, the car was back and Mr. Vaughn was inside the car.
That's when she saw Mr. Edward Vaughn in the presence of Mr. Jake Miller.
I knew Jake because I had seen him around the apartment complex before. He had a friend that stayed in the apartment complex, but never seen him around Mr. Vaughn ever. He was so out of place. Jake seemed agitated. He was very aggressive, mad, almost. I guess you could say, it just felt wrong. I approached Mr. Vaughn. The left side of his face was so swollen. It was horrifying. I asked him what the heck happened to his face, and he whispers to me to call 911. And that's when I took him inside his apartment. I had unlocked the door behind us. I grabbed the phone and I dialed 911.
At some point prior to the arrival of law enforcement, Jake Miller left.
One of those neighbors said that she was actually awake between 4:30 and 6 a.m. and heard who she knew to be Tommy Trosper at Mr. Vaughn's residence. We were also able to verify through another neighbor that Tommy Trosper was at Mr. Vaughn's house on the morning of the 911 call.
Jake and Tommy were very well known to us, mainly in property crimes, some assaults. The key thing here is that Tommy Trosper and Jake Miller were thick as thieves, so to speak. They were friends. They were always around each other. So the fact that Tommy and Jake were identified being together, it really streamlined the investigation because now law enforcement had suspects. Once it was identified that Tommy Trosper and Jake Miller were actually the suspects that we were looking for, it was extremely important to find them.
We initially notified surrounding law enforcement agencies. We issued a BOLO for Tommy Trosper and Jake Miller. We exhausted no resources in that attempt to locate them. They did tell us that Mr. Vaughn's health was deteriorating and that if we wanted to speak to him, that we needed to speak with him fairly quickly.
The purpose of speaking with Edward Vaughn was to obtain what law enforcement calls a dying declaration. To obtain an official identification of the suspect was extremely crucial in this investigation.
Based on Mr. Vaughn's injuries, it was very difficult for him to speak. So we actually sent Detective Manus photos of Tommy Trosper and Jake Miller to confirm the identity of the suspects.
I remember walking into the ICU unit, and when I looked at Edward Vaughn, I was absolutely speechless. I've been doing this job for 30 years. I have seen evil in just about every way you can imagine. I've seen crimes that would keep you awake at night. When I seen what this man looked like and the extent of his injuries, it absolutely stunned me to the point where I had to gather my composure. And I recall that his eyes looked at me. He had the most sincere eyes. He had the most comforting. I told him what I was there for. I said, I want you to be able to identify these people. I said, do you know them? I said, if you know who these people are, can you blink your eyes for me? And he blinked his eyes. I said, Mr. Vaughn, I said, are these the people that hurt you? And he just blinked his eyes. I said, if you're 100%, I want you to blink twice for me. And I no sooner said that than he blinked twice. And that was a solid identification. I remember his eyes. I'll never forget them.
The police department pursued the vehicle. After a short pursuit, they're actually able to take the driver into custody. Tommy Trosper was then arrested for being in possession of a stolen vehicle and was then taken to the White County Sheriff's Department where he was processed and booked on those charges.
Our detectives went and pulled him from there before he was even dressed out on his charges. It was going to be tough to get a true confession out of Tommy. He was no stranger to this type of criminal procedure, but we had to try to get him to talk.
You want some coffee to kind of relax you a little bit?
I actually seen the face of Edward Vaughn, and I was looking at the person who made Edward Vaughn look like he looked, who beat that man to that condition. The suspect's confession is exactly what I wanted.
A 91-year-old man is fighting for his life after police say he was kidnapped from his Judsonia home Monday morning.
We were all very much shocked. We never thought that something like that could happen in our neighborhood, much less to a man as kind as Mr. Vaughn.
We knew from past encounters that Tommy Trosper had with law enforcement that we needed to cut straight to the chase. Building a rapport with Tommy Trosper was useless.
Okay. Tell me about Edward Vaughn. You was there, Tommy. We got witnesses, we got statements. Don't jack her out. Just tell me what happened, bro.
What is this about a week and a half or so ago? And I was gonna buy a truck that he's got for real, like, and I asked him about it, and I looked at the truck. You know, he said you bought it for, I think he said $600 or something. And the old man said, "Well, I give it to you for what I paid for it." I said, "Well, I can't do that." You know, I said, "Well, look, man, this is all I got," and it was like 200 and some loose bills.
Okay.
And then a week ago, we took him. We went and ate Chinese food. Well, on the way back, he reached up and said, "I'm better than anybody's ever anymore." And I was like, "Whoa, what?" You know, and I kind of freaked out.
About Ed Vaughn?
Yeah, and I kind of freaked out, and I was like, "Whoa, man, don't ever talk to me like that again." And then after that, it seemed like every day he would, "Come on, man, just let me see it, show it to me." And nobody believed me. So I stood there one day and just held my phone and recorded while he was talking to me. And I played the video back and I said, "Man," I was like, "I could show this to somebody and you probably get in trouble for it, I don't know."
In the state of Arkansas, one adult propositioning another adult for sex is not illegal whatsoever. Knowing Tommy Trosper, that immediately brought my interest because he's starting to pad his involvement. He's starting to make it a little bit easier for the world to understand why he did what he did.
I'm just gonna bribe Bill and like, "Hey, like, if you let me give you what I got, I won't turn this into the police."
So you were gonna bribe him?
I mean, kind of, but...
For what reason?
Because I was going to pay $600 for...
The video? See if it can go down for a lower price or something?
I don't think that video bothered Tommy in any way at all, other than the fact it gave him the motive that he need to later blackmail Edward Vaughn.
Okay. Hey, you told me things got out of hand yesterday, so what happened yesterday?
Me and Jay, we picked him up.
Picked him up at his house, right?
Yeah.
Okay, where you take him?
To Chris's house.
Chris who's? Chris Torres?
Yeah.
So you and Jay went to Chris's house in Red River Shores?
Yeah.
I knew that Chris Torres and Tommy Trosper were probably acquaintances, to say the least.
Chris Torres did have a building next to his house out there that they did work on cars. Maybe Tommy thought he could take that car out there and Chris could look at it and see if it was worth buying.
Where'd the old man get hit at?
Where you hit?
Yeah. At his house or Red River Shores?
At the shores. Yeah, but it was...
Who hit him?
Jay.
Jake hit him? You didn't hit him?
I wouldn't hit that old ass man. Jake started smacking him up like, you're gonna do this and that and this, and I was like, "Man, no, don't, you know, what do you?" I pushed Jake, you know what I'm saying? Jake, don't, no, dude, don't hit him, he's old. And then I was like, "Whatever, dude, I'm not in it," and I just walked off.
So you walk off. Did Jake tie his hands with zip ties? Jake did? When did his hands get tied?
Right before he took him home. I don't know why.
So Jake tied his hands at Red River Shores, that's what you're telling me. And then hit him. And then took him home? Ain't no damn sense.
I mean, It's, I mean, yeah. I mean, yeah, not really, kind of, not really, though. And, like, yeah.
Tommy is incoherent. He's stuttering. Truthful person just simply needs to recount an event where a liar needs to create it.
One question.
Yes.
Why didn't you call the police after it all happened? If you had nothing to do with it, why didn't you call the police?
I mean, I don't know.
You just got through saying you had nothing to do with it, so why didn't you call the police?
I'm scared, man. I'm a drug addict, man. I can't help it. I need help, man.
That's got nothing to do with you picking up your phone, calling 911 anonymously, and saying, here's what I just saying. Give me one good reason why you didn't do it, and I'll believe you. One reason. You just got there saying multiple times that you weren't going to be involved in hitting him because he's an old man. Because you have a conscience about that. You're not going to hurt an old man. But yet you see an old man get beaten. You see an old man get tied up. You see an old man get hurt, and you did nothing about it, nor did you call the police. Am I getting all of that about bundled up right? You claimed you were going to tell the police about it, but that's not really what I was trying. That's not really what you were going to do, because you also admitted your words were you were going to use it to bribe him to lower the price of the drug. But that was your words. That's what you said. Yeah, that's what you said.
You had this video. This was your idea. You took it, and you did so with a purpose. It just showed that Tommy was the mastermind behind this whole thing.
My next step, I wanted to 100% identify him as the actual ringleader behind this. Sometime turning up the heat will let you know exactly where you are in the interview.
I'm gonna tell you what I think. This is just mind working. I think it's all your idea. And why don't we see if we can make this truck payment go down just a little bit? I think you were the ringleader. You were the mastermind. You said that you videoed him with the intention to bribe him. You just admitted it. You let me talk now. You never walked off. It's been your plan to the beginning. It was your plan to get him to lower the price on that truck, and when he wouldn't lower the price on that truck, it went too far. Is that it? Then y'all gonna tie him up, scared the
Got him getting a low price on that truck.
No.
Was the man afraid? The man was not afraid getting hit and
I mean, they really scared. I'm sure you had fear. I'm scared to death right now.
Oh, you should be.
I was trying to get him to lower the price on the truck.
No.
What do you think he told us?
The old man was fine.
He's not fine. He's in ICU at St. Vincent's Little Rock. Ain't not, mate. That's how serious this is, bud. You know what I can see? Maybe the video didn't work. Maybe like, the video didn't work. So I know, we'll amp it up a little bit. So I'll tie him up, put something over his head, make him think we're gonna hurt him. Maybe that get him to lower the price on that truck, right?
No, Jake just smacked him, like out of nowhere.
You standing right there, we got tied up, yes or no?
I was
Right
in the
there.
yard somewhere.
Right there with him.
I was somewhere in the
He's
yard.
right there with him, talking to you, having a conversation
I know,
with him.
I was somewhere in the
You're having a
yard.
conversation with him.
I understand that, dude.
I know. Don't you holler at me, brother.
Man, you
Don't you holler at me.
You keep cutting me
No,
off.
because you won't tell me the
You're asking me where the was.
Exactly. Where were you?
When he
Where were you at? What days and rabbit? Where were you at?
walked up over to him. You know what I'm saying? They're sitting, the old man's sitting in the car. I walked up right there.
So after hours of speaking with Tommy Trosper, he still was lying. He would talk to us enough to verify his involvement. However, he wouldn't give us the details of his involvement.
If he said nothing else, we present him to the jury as a liar, and that is amazing advantages for the prosecution.
How many lies you told me?
I'm not lying to you. Seriously, I can't. I'm not. I know the.
You know what? But you know.
No, man. I feel.
The most important things that we were able to get from an interview with Tommy was Tommy's admission that him and Jake Miller at one point in time were in the presence of Edward Vaughn. Had taken Edward Vaughn to someplace out in the county, which is identified as Chris Torres's house, that him and Jake Miller were present when Edward Vaughn was bound against his will, that they were present when Edward Vaughn was assaulted. So basically it was a confession, but just in piecemeal.
Trosper, you got anything else to say, man? Huh? No? Right now, you're under arrest for kidnapping, battery 2. Your bond's been set $250,000. So I need you to go ahead and stand up. We'll walk you to the bank and you got to pay the process. Oh, you're going to miss this wheel.
We had Tommy in jail, and now the next step is absolutely find Jake.
Chris Torres told law enforcement that on April the 9th of 2017 that Tommy Trosper, whom he knew, and Jake Miller, whom he knew, came to his residence in Judsonia with Edward Vaughn, and that Tommy Trosper showed Chris Torres a video that he had.
At one point, Tom asked Chris did he want to help in quote-unquote roughing Edward Vaughn up, and Chris Torres told him no.
According to Chris, that was when he saw Edward Vaughn actually bound with zip ties.
Chris said he becomes upset and he's ordered him, you got to get out of here, get off my place. I'm not involved with this, and they leave. Another thing that Chris was willing to tell us was that Jake's hiding out in an abandoned trailer, just a few trailers down from where he was living. So we left immediately from Chris Torres's house and drove down the road looking for the address. We surrounded that house and ultimately found Jake Miller and took him into custody.
Based off the evidence alone, we suspected that Jake Miller was just along for the ride of the co-conspirator. We believe that this was all Tommy's doings, that Tommy was the main puppet master behind this. Tommy Trosper was the one that wanted the vehicle. Tommy Trosper was the one that knew Chris Torres, and that's where they took Edward Vaughn. Tommy Trosper was the one that recorded the secret video.
We had Tommy's story. We had Tommy blaming Jake for a lot of stuff. So now we're going to try to see how truthful Jake might be and how different a story he was going to tell from what Tommy told.
Initial about each one of your yeses, not saying you're going to talk to me, it's just saying I read them to you, you understood them, it's right there.
Talk to you, no.
Edward Vaughn. What you know about it, bro?
We didn't do
You didn't do it?
it. No.
I got witness statements. I got Tommy Trosper locked up saying he did it. Brother, I'm angry, man. Sometimes it's just best to be honest.
He already knows why he's there, and he's automatically going to a denial. That strategy is just to make him feel like he's standing alone, like everybody else has blamed you. We know exactly what happened, so we're past you telling the lies and trying to protect your friends because they blamed it all on you.
You're going to have to remember a little bit. Oh, man. Tell us what happened. Tell us the whole truth.
you scared of?
You're just worried about the consequences. Worried about your freedom, aren't you?
Yes. And look, I try so hard to do good.
Well, we're in a pretty bad spot, but we can get through it, Jay. But the best way to get through it is to be honest about it. That's the best cards you can play right now. That's just me being honest with you. You want to start over and tell us what happened, buddy?
Started off when we first went over it. I didn't know what we were doing. Tommy told me to go with it. And he went and knocked on the door. The old man came out. And he showed him the video. And then that's when Tommy hit him. Oh God, he was like stunned. And then after that, we went to Chris's, and Chris told us to get him in and out of there.
Well, I know you helped him, Tommy.
No, Tommy told me to blindfold him. Then I said, man, I'm sorry.
Right.
But I was told to do this.
Okay. So Tommy tied him, tied his hands, you blindfolded him, then what?
We went right and he was trying to find somewhere to put him.
Okay. Did Tommy talk about killing him?
He said he should.
He should kill him. Okay. Then what?
We rode and at the end of it, it was morning time. Tommy dropped me and the old man off. And that's when I cut off the zip ties and was going back to the old guy's place.
So y'all go back, you take him back home, you cut the zip ties off of him, then y'all take him home.
And then Tommy left and the older guy, I guess he went into someone's house and I guess they asked about his face. And he told them.
How'd you leave?
My cousin came and got me.
Getting Jake to actually admit these little key pieces was absolutely critical in this investigation. Primarily because Jake began to confirm exactly what Edward Vaughn said earlier.
Tommy hit him. They said, be aggressive.
Probably wanted everybody to rough him up, didn't you?
How many times you hit him?
I slapped him once.
Slapped him.
I mean, I know that really looks bad on me, but I can't lie. I just wasn't thinking.
Chris ever hit you?
Not that I see.
So what are you sorry for exactly?
I'm sorry for even being there.
Well, friends and drugs.
Not thinking.
I felt like he opened up and told us more of the truth. I think Jake Miller was scared. I think he was worried about the outcomes and the situation he had found himself in, where Tommy, I don't think, cared about any of that.
It's the two individuals pieced stories together that we was able to find a basic consistency that supported the allegation by Edward Vaughn.
But it was hopeful that Mr. Vaughn would pull through and be strong enough to testify in court against the two and actually be able to be the victim that stands up there and points at them and says, these are the men that attacked me and did this to me. We received a call from the hospital Mr. Vaughn was at that he had actually passed away from his injuries. And that changed everything for us.
it's always the cases like this that involve children or the elderly that can't defend themselves that you take most to heart as an investigator, you know. So, you know.
He was a very sweet man. It broke my heart that something of this tragic could happen to a person so kind.
The charges were amended from kidnapping and battery to actual capital murder and kidnapping.
Without having any type of forensic evidence, and now we have a victim that's not going to be there to testify in court. It was all on us. We were going to have to tell Mr. Vaughn's story and seek justice for him.
I felt it was extremely important to interview Tommy Trosper again to see if he had any remorse for what they did, and see if Tommy Trosper would admit it, and if he would admit it, if he would tell the truth.
All right, well, we're going to update you on it. What's your highest level of education?
So now we was wanting to see how far he would be willing to go speaking with us when we tell him that his charges are upgraded to the most heinous charge of a criminal act you can be charged with in this state.
What we want to let you know is that we received a phone call today from St. Vincent's Infirmary indicating that Mr. Vaughn has died. Your charges will be upgraded to capital murder. Is there anything that you would like to say on your behalf?
What is he going to do? Is he going to actually admit this? Is he going to tell the truth to save himself? Or is he going to continue on with his lies and deflection?
I could imagine hearing that kind of news, especially if I knew that this man's death was because of something I did. But this gives you the opportunity to actually go into a little bit of detail, and perhaps other people that will be watching this video can hear how sorry you are for what you did. Are you sorry? Now is really the time for truth. Now's not the time for lying. Okay? Your story hasn't changed. You say that you had absolutely no involvement in hitting him. Correct?
I didn't hit him.
Okay. So if anyone else comes forward and testifies that they've seen you hit him, they're lying.
I mean, yeah.
They are. Well, if they are, they aren't.
They are.
Does it surprise you that Jake's not telling the same story you're telling? Why would Jake not tell the same story you're telling? Jake's saying you both hit him, that he shares the same involvement as you did. Y'all both hit him. That's what Jake said. You're saying you didn't. And here's the problem I have with this. You were wanting to buy the vehicle, you made the video, yet you had nothing to do with assaulting him or binding him or nothing like that. What was Jake's purpose for doing this?
I don't know what was going through Jake's head.
Could it be because you're not telling the truth because you're afraid? Let's call a spade a spade.
I did not foresee Tommy Trosper being any more sympathetic to the plight of Edward Vaughn than what he was the first time around, even with being leveled with the accusation of a capital murder upgrade, but I was wanting to see.
Well, yeah, it does look pretty bad.
What do you mean?
You were driving, the man's laying in the back seat. You didn't hit him with this. You didn't hit him over the hand and slap him.
I don't recall him at all. I'm seriously telling the truth.
Do you realize the gravity of the situation that you're in?
I understand.
Okay, because it don't make sense. That's why you sitting here and saying that you didn't do it. 12 jurors is going to have a difficulty in believing that because I just laid out the factors that they would have a problem with.
I understand.
No, you don't understand,
I really
because
do.
you know what you did. And why you will not admit to the truth is something that you're going to have to deal with on your own. I kind of sort of figured we could get it out now, because here's what you need to understand. Mr. Vaughn was in a critical care unit in St. Vincent's for several days. He is now at the state crime lab with a medical autopsy being conducted. They're going to know exactly what happened. And when you stand before the court, ready? I didn't do it. That don't fare well. But what will fare well is that you tell the truth about what you did and explain your involvement. That's the only time we're going to get you to be able to do that.
I'm trying to. He was talking to me.
He is a 91-year-old man that was beat up, zip-tied, and held against his will. And you're now saying that the only person that did all of this was a scrawny little kid named Jake Miller? Are you seriously wanting us to believe that? That you had no involvement whatsoever, but yet you conceal your crime? You hide it. Mr. Vaughn didn't die immediately. Do you not understand that he was able to tell us who did what and what happened? Do you understand that? Are you sure there's nothing more you need to say? I'm putting this out here for your benefit. He didn't die immediately. He told us what happened. The reason why we didn't bring it to you when you were arrested is because we was wanting to see what you said. He is now dead. That changes the entire ballpark. Understand, he didn't die immediately. Once again, is there anything else you want to say from what you previously said according to your involvement, knowing that we spoke with him? Tommy, now's the time. Mr. Vaughn said that in that vehicle you knocked the horse out of him. Period. You hit him. You hit him. Putting it out. That's what Mr. Vaughn says. Are you telling me that he is lying? You hit him in the face. He didn't die that day. He died just yesterday. We know what happened. We're giving you this opportunity to explain yourself.
That's what I didn't know.
Okay, Tom.
And look, I mean, yeah, I had involvement in that. Yeah.
I know you had involvement.
Because, I mean, I was the reason we picked him up.
I know.
Even with presented with the possibility of being charged with murder, he maintained his specific denial.
I tried to tell you my story, man.
Now here's what you need to do, because Jake Miller just did it. It's your fault. I'll just give you one last time to answer that question, and then I won't bother you anymore.
I promise you I didn't hit him.
At this point in time, we cannot give you any other opportunity to explain yourself. Edward Vaughn is dead because of what Tommy Trosper and Jake Miller did to him. That's unequivocal. That is unprecedented truth. The only person whose story is different is you. Only person. Story's different. Is you. And are you sure that's what you want to go to court with? Being the only person who looks like a liar. Is that what you want to do?
I don't know what the hell happened, really.
I have already established he is a liar. So now the strategy was, I wanted to show the jury exactly the type of person you're going to be seeing.
Okay. One more question, and then I'll just go and leave this alone. It's not a question, it's a statement. It's a statement I want to hear from you. I want you to reach deep down in your soul. If I'm Mr. Vaughn and I'm sitting right here, or I'm Mr. Vaughn's family and I'm sitting right here, what would you say to them? Let them hear your soul. What would you say to them? Lots of words? Okay. Well, we thank you for speaking with us. Your charges have been officially upgraded to kidnapping and capital murder. There is no bond set for you at this point. All right.
Even though we weren't able to get a full confession from Tommy Trosper, he put himself there, he put himself as a participant, and he gave us the motive, which I believe was the only motive.
I felt we were extremely successful in the interview because Tommy Trosper did confirm the basics, but he also confirmed that he had absolutely no sympathy or any remorse for what he did.
Out of all the cases I've worked, I've never went to a victim's funeral. I just felt honored to be at that funeral.
So it's a very unique thing about the Veterans Cemetery in Arkansas because whenever you go onto those grounds, it demands silence, it demands reverence. And I couldn't think of a better place for Edward Vaughn to rest.
Tommy Trosper pled guilty to murder in the first degree and kidnapping and was sentenced to 40 years in the Arkansas Department of Corrections. Later, Jake Miller pled guilty to murder in the first degree and kidnapping and was sentenced to 20 years in the Arkansas Department of Corrections. I'm happy with the investigation. I'm satisfied that we were able to get that conviction that we needed for this case and do what we could to get justice for Edward Vaughn.
Mr. Vaughn was pretty amazing, and it's great to be able to call a World War II veteran a friend.
I would like him to be remembered as a kind, gentle man. Thank you for serving our country. I'm very grateful to have gotten to be a part of Mr. Vaughn's life.
Edward Vaughn should be remembered as the person who he was, a hero, a true hero.
The apartment was silent for 43 years. Behind one locked door, behind walls that had witnessed the final moments of a woman's life, a mystery remained frozen in time. A case that haunted investigators. A death that left a community searching for answers. A name that refused to disappear from the headlines. Patricia Beard. A woman whose final hours became the center of one of the most disturbing cold cases in memory. A woman found inside her own home. A crime scene filled with questions. A murder that seemed to vanish into the shadows, leaving behind only fragments of evidence, unanswered questions, and a family desperate for the truth. For decades, the apartment where Patricia Beard was discovered remained more than just a location. It became a symbol of a mystery that refused to die. Because some crimes do not end when the investigation goes cold. Some crimes wait. They wait for a new clue, a forgotten detail, a piece of evidence that was overlooked. And sometimes, after decades of silence, they return with a shocking revelation. This is the story of Patricia Beard, the woman whose death became a cold case that stretched across generations, a mystery that challenged investigators for more than 4 decades, and a case that finally revealed answers hidden for years. It began with an ordinary day that turned into a nightmare. The kind of day no one expects to remember forever. Neighbors went about their routines. Cars moved through the streets. People opened their doors, went to work, and continued their lives without knowing that something terrible had already happened behind one apartment door. Inside that home, Patricia Beard's life had come to a sudden and violent end. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. The first responders who entered the apartment were confronted with a scene that immediately suggested something was wrong. This was not an accident. This was not a disappearance. This was a crime. A woman had been killed, and whoever was responsible had disappeared. In the hours that followed, investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing Patricia's final moments. Every object inside the apartment became a possible clue. Every movement around the building became a possible lead. Every person who crossed paths with Patricia became part of the investigation. But from the beginning, the case carried an unsettling question. Who would want Patricia Beard dead? Those who knew her described a woman with her own routines, her own relationships, and her own place within the community. She was not just a name written in a police report. She was someone with memories, connections, and people who expected to see her again. But instead of answers, they were left with grief. And investigators were left with a puzzle. The early stages of any murder investigation are often the most critical. Detectives move quickly. Evidence is collected. Witnesses are interviewed. Timelines are built. Every second matters. But some cases are different. Some cases seem to lose momentum before the truth can be found. The investigation into Patricia Beard's death entered a world of uncertainty. Leads appeared and disappeared. Possibilities were considered and eliminated. The passage of time began to work against everyone searching for justice. Because time changes everything. Memories fade. Witnesses move away. Evidence becomes harder to analyze. And the person responsible for the crime gains one thing that investigators can never recover: time. Years passed. The headlines became quieter. The public moved on to other stories. But for Patricia's loved ones, the questions remained exactly where they had always been. Who entered that apartment? What happened in those final moments? Why did someone decide that Patricia Beard's life should end? And why did the truth remain hidden for so long? For the investigators who refused to forget the case, Patricia's name remained on the list of unfinished business. A cold case. A file that could not be closed. A mystery waiting for the right moment to be reopened. Behind every cold case is a silent battle between memory and time. The longer an investigation remains unsolved, the more impossible it can seem to uncover the truth. But history has shown that even the oldest mysteries can sometimes be broken open. A single discovery can change everything. A new technology. A new investigator. A new look at old evidence. And in Patricia Beard's case, decades after the crime shocked the community, something began to shift. The case that many believed had disappeared forever was suddenly alive again. The questions that had remained unanswered for 43 years were being asked once more. And this time, investigators were not looking only at what happened on the day Patricia died. They were looking deeper, into the evidence, into the timeline, into the secrets that had remained hidden since the beginning. Because somewhere inside the forgotten details of the past was the answer everyone had been searching for. The truth had been there all along. Waiting. For 43 years, the murder of Patricia Beard remained a haunting question without an answer. A name in an old case file. A photograph preserved in police records. A memory carried by those who refused to believe that justice would never come. But behind every cold case is a story that continues long after the crime scene disappears. The apartment where Patricia Beard was found eventually became just another place in the city. The walls remained standing. The streets continued to fill with ordinary life. New generations moved through the neighborhood, unaware that decades earlier, a violent crime had taken place behind one of those doors. But investigators never truly forgot. Because murder cases are not only about evidence. They're about people. And Patricia Beard was a person whose life ended in a way that left too many unanswered questions. The investigation began with one central mission: reconstruct the final moments. Find out who was there. Discover what happened inside that apartment. But the deeper detectives looked, the more complicated the mystery became. The first challenge was understanding Patricia's life before the crime. Who was she? Or her habits? Who did she trust? Who had access to her world? These questions are the foundation of every homicide investigation. Detectives must separate ordinary details from the details that matter. A simple phone call, a missed appointment, a conversation remembered years later. Something insignificant at the time can become the key to an entire case. Investigators began speaking with people who knew Patricia, friends, neighbors, anyone who could help create a picture of the woman behind the headlines. They searched for patterns. They searched for conflicts. They searched for anything that could explain why someone would target her. But instead of a clear motive, they encountered uncertainty. There was no simple explanation, no obvious answer, no immediate suspect who could make the case fall into place. And that made the crime even more disturbing. Because the most frightening mysteries are often not the ones where the truth is hidden. They're the ones where the truth seems to have vanished completely. In the days following Patricia's death, the apartment became the center of the investigation. Every corner was examined. Every item was considered. Detectives collected evidence, documented the scene, and attempted to reconstruct a timeline of events. A crime scene tells a story, not with words, with details. The position of objects, the condition of the room, the smallest traces left behind. Investigators know that criminals often believe they can erase what they have done. They believe time will destroy evidence. They believe memories will fade and questions will disappear. But investigators search for what remains. A fingerprint, a biological trace, a witness who remembers something years later, a connection no one noticed before. At the time, however, the technology available to investigators was limited compared to today. Modern forensic science can reveal information that detectives from decades ago could only imagine. DNA analysis, advanced databases, and improved investigative methods have transformed countless cold cases. But when Patricia Beard's case first began, investigators were working with the tools they had. And sometimes those tools were not enough. The investigation continued, but answers remained out of reach. The community felt the impact. A murder inside a residential building changes the way people see the place they call home. Familiar hallways suddenly feel different. Every day, sounds become suspicious. Neighbors begin wondering what they did not see, what they did not hear, and whether the person responsible had been closer than anyone imagined. Fear spreads quickly after a violent crime. But so does curiosity. People wanted to know who killed Patricia Beard. They wanted to know whether the killer was a stranger who appeared and disappeared without a trace, or someone who was already part of her life. That possibility was one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, because many unsolved murders leave behind the same terrifying question. Was the person responsible someone unknown, or someone trusted? As months turned into years, investigators followed different possibilities. Every lead had to be examined. Every theory had to be tested. But slowly, the case entered the most difficult stage for any investigation. Silence. The phone stopped ringing. New information became rare. The urgency that existed during the first days after the murder faded with time. The world moved forward. But Patricia Beard's case remained frozen. For her family, the passing years brought a different kind of pain. There was no trial, no conviction, no moment in court where they could hear the truth. There was only uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that follows families of victims for decades. Every anniversary became a reminder. Every unanswered question became heavier. And every new cold case solved somewhere else raised the same painful thought. Could Patricia's case ever be solved? For investigators, the file remained open, even when there were no new leads, even when years passed without progress. Because a cold case is never truly dead. It is simply waiting. And sometimes, the smallest forgotten detail can bring everything back. A name buried in records. A piece of evidence preserved in storage. A witness who finally decides to speak. A technology that did not exist when the crime happened. For Patricia Beard, the breakthrough would not come quickly. It would not come after months. It would not come after years. The case would survive decades of uncertainty. 43 years of silence. 43 years of questions. 43 years with a person responsible remained unknown. But while the world forgot, investigators continued searching for the missing piece. The clue that could finally connect the past to the present. Because somewhere, someone knew what happened inside that apartment. Someone knew how Patricia Beard's life ended. And after all those years, the truth was still waiting to be found. For decades, the murder of Patricia Beard existed in the darkest category of criminal investigations. A cold case. A file that carried more questions than answers. A crime that remained trapped in the past while the world around it continued to change. But behind every unsolved murder is a timeline. A sequence of moments that can reveal the truth if investigators can uncover the missing pieces. And for Patricia Beard, those missing pieces were hidden somewhere between the last ordinary moments of her life and the terrifying discovery that followed. The challenge was not only finding evidence. The challenge was understanding what the evidence meant. Because a crime scene is never just a place where something happened. It is a silent witness. It holds memories. It holds traces. It holds the final chapter of a person's story. And investigators knew that inside Patricia Beard's apartment was the answer to one question that had haunted them from the beginning. Who was responsible? The years after the murder created an almost impossible obstacle. People remembered less. Details became uncertain. Events that once seemed clear became blurred by time. Human memory is fragile. A person can remember a face but forget a name. Remember a conversation but forget the exact words. Remember a feeling but lose the details. For investigators reopening old cases, time is both the enemy and the test. The enemy because evidence disappears. The test because only the strongest clues survive. And in Patricia Beard's case, something had survived. Something that would eventually bring the investigation back into the spotlight. But before that breakthrough could happen, investigators had to revisit the past. They had to return to the beginning. They had to ask the same questions again. Not because they had failed, but because sometimes the truth is hidden in the details everyone has already seen. A new investigation often begins with an old file. A box filled with reports, photographs, statements, evidence records, pages written decades earlier by detectives who searched for answers with the resources available at the time. Inside those records was the story of a woman whose death shocked those who knew her. Patricia Beard was no longer just a victim in a homicide investigation. She became the center of a mission to restore the truth. Cold case investigators understand something that many people outside law enforcement do not. An unsolved case is not simply forgotten. It stays alive. The names remain. The questions remain. The pain remains. And every investigator who takes on a cold case carries the responsibility of solving something that others could not. They're not only searching for a suspect. They're searching for justice that has been delayed for years. When investigators looked again at Patricia Beard's murder, they approached it with a different perspective. Technology had changed. Scientific methods had improved. Evidence that once seemed impossible to use could now reveal information. The smallest details could become powerful. A microscopic trace. A previously unknown connection. A piece of evidence that had waited quietly for decades. The investigation entered a new era. The old case file was no longer just a record of failure. It became a roadmap. A map showing where investigators had searched, what they had discovered, and what they had missed. The process of reopening a cold case is rarely dramatic at first. There are no flashing lights, no immediate confession, no instant answers. Instead, it begins with patience. Detectives review documents. They compare information. They search databases. They speak with people connected to the original investigation. They look for contradictions. They look for patterns. They look for anything that does not fit. Because in a decades-old murder, the smallest inconsistency can become the biggest clue. And as Patricia Beard's case was examined again, investigators began seeing the crime through a new lens. The question was no longer only what happened in the apartment. The question became, what had everyone overlooked? For 43 years, the person responsible had lived with the knowledge of what happened. They had watched the case fade. They had watched the headlines disappear. They had watched investigators come and go. They may have believed they had escaped forever. But cold cases have a way of returning. A criminal may forget details, but evidence does not forget. The passage of time can hide the truth, but it can also preserve it. And sometimes, decades later, science can reveal what human eyes could not. As the investigation continued, attention turned toward the evidence collected from the original crime scene. Evidence that had been stored away. Evidence that had remained untouched for years. Evidence that carried the possibility of finally answering the questions that had haunted everyone connected to Patricia Beard's death. The world had changed since the day she was killed. The neighborhood had changed. Technology had changed. The people involved had changed. But one thing remained exactly the same. Someone had taken Patricia Beard's life. And someone still knew the truth. The search for that truth became a race against time. Because even after 43 years, justice depended on one thing: finding the connection between the past and the present. Finding the person who had remained hidden in plain sight. Finding the final piece of a mystery that had lasted longer than anyone ever expected. And as investigators dug deeper into the forgotten details of the case, they discovered that the answers they were searching for were closer than they had imagined. The silence surrounding Patricia Beard's murder was about to be broken. Not by a rumor, not by a theory, but by evidence. Evidence that had been waiting for more than 4 decades to finally speak. For 43 years, the murder of Patricia Beard remained a mystery that refused to disappear. A case that had survived changing detectives, changing technology, and decades of unanswered questions. But every cold case has a moment when the past begins to come back to life. For Patricia Beard, that moment began with a closer examination of what had been left behind. Because time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes time protects it. Hidden inside old records, preserved inside evidence storage, and buried beneath years of investigation history were details that had never truly been forgotten. They had simply been waiting. The world of criminal investigations had changed dramatically since Patricia's death. When the original investigation began, detectives relied heavily on traditional methods: interviews, physical evidence, witness statements, careful observation. But decades later, investigators had access to tools that earlier detectives could only dream of. DNA analysis had transformed the way old crimes were investigated. A tiny biological trace could reveal a connection. A piece of evidence once considered insignificant could become the center of an entire case. And for Patricia Beard, the possibility of finding answers depended on looking at the past with the technology of the present. Investigators began reviewing everything again. Not because the original detectives had failed, but because every investigation is limited by what is available at the time. A case solved today may depend on technology that did not exist yesterday. The evidence collected decades earlier was examined with new questions. Could something hidden be found? Could a person connected to the crime finally be identified? Could the silence surrounding Patricia Beard's death finally be broken? These questions drove the renewed investigation. But cold cases are never solved by technology alone. They require patience. They require determination. And they require investigators willing to challenge assumptions that have existed for decades. Because sometimes the greatest obstacle in an old case is not a lack of evidence. It is the belief that everything has already been discovered. Investigators began looking beyond the original theories. They reviewed the people connected to Patricia's life. They examined relationships. They looked at possible motives. They reconsidered individuals who may have previously been overlooked. Every person who had crossed paths with Patricia became part of the larger picture. Friends, acquaintances, people who knew her routines, people who knew where she lived, people who may have had information they never shared. The investigation was no longer only about what happened inside the apartment. It was about understanding everything that surrounded Patricia's final days. Who had contact with her? Who had access to her? Who had a reason to hurt her? And, perhaps most importantly, who had something to hide? The reopening of a cold case often creates a strange moment. The victim's name suddenly returns to public attention. Old memories resurface. People who once believed the story was finished begin asking questions again. For the community connected to Patricia Beard, the renewed investigation brought a mixture of emotions. Hope, fear, curiosity, and the painful reminder of what had been lost. For more than 4 decades, the absence of answers had created its own kind of wound. An unanswered murder is not only a criminal mystery. It is an unfinished story. Families do not receive closure. Communities do not receive certainty. And the victim remains frozen forever at the moment their life ended. Patricia Beard had spent decades waiting for her story to be completed. And now, investigators were determined to finish what had started so many years earlier. But solving a cold case is a race against more than time. It is a race against fading memories, a race against changing circumstances, a race against the possibility that crucial witnesses may no longer be available. Every year that passes creates another barrier, but every year also creates new possibilities. Because people change, circumstances change, and sometimes someone who remains silent for decades finally decides to speak. Sometimes guilt becomes too heavy. Sometimes a secret becomes impossible to protect. Sometimes the truth finds a way out. As investigators continued examining Patricia Beard's case, attention focused on the evidence that could finally provide a breakthrough. The clues that had been collected at the beginning. The details recorded in the first reports. The information that had survived nearly half a century. The investigation moved slowly, carefully, methodically, because in a case this old, one mistake could mean losing the answer forever. But investigators knew something important. They did not need hundreds of clues. They needed one. One connection. One discovery. One moment that would change everything. For years, the person responsible for Patricia Beard's death had lived knowing the truth. They had carried that secret through decades of history, through changes in technology, through new generations of investigators, through a world that had almost forgotten the crime. But the case was no longer silent. The evidence was beginning to speak. And as investigators uncovered more information, a shocking possibility began to emerge. The answer to Patricia Beard's murder had not disappeared. It had been waiting inside the evidence, waiting inside the memories, waiting for the moment when someone would finally look closely enough, After 43 years, the mystery surrounding Patricia Beard's death was approaching a turning point. The cold case that once seemed impossible was moving toward a revelation. A revelation that would finally force everyone connected to the case to confront the truth. Because no matter how much time passes, no matter how many years go by, a murder does not forget its victim, and justice does not stop searching. For decades, Patricia Beard's name existed in a place where no family wants a loved one to remain. A cold case file, a photograph attached to an investigation, a memory surrounded by unanswered questions. The years had passed, but the mystery had never truly disappeared. And as investigators returned to the case, they faced the same impossible challenge that had existed from the beginning. Finding the person responsible for a crime committed more than 4 decades earlier. Time had created distance, but it had also created something else. Opportunity. Because while years can erase details, they can also reveal what was hidden. People who once refused to talk may reconsider. Old assumptions may be challenged. Evidence once considered meaningless may suddenly become critical. And in Patricia Beard's case, investigators were about to discover that the past still had secrets left to reveal. The renewed investigation required patience. There was no single moment where everything suddenly became clear. No dramatic confession. No immediate answer. Instead, detectives had to rebuild the case piece by piece. They went back through the original investigation. They studied the reports written decades earlier. They examined photographs. They reviewed interviews. They looked for anything that might have been missed. Because a cold case is often solved not by finding something completely new. It is solved by seeing something old in a different way. A detail that once seemed ordinary. A clue that once appeared insignificant. A connection that no one recognized. Investigators understand that every crime leaves behind a story. But sometimes that story is written in a language that cannot be understood until years later. Technology was changing the way investigators approached old cases. Scientific advancements allowed detectives to return to evidence with new possibilities. The same evidence that once provided no answers could now contain information powerful enough to change everything. And that possibility brought new energy into Patricia Beard's investigation. The case was no longer viewed as a mystery trapped in the past. It became an active search for the truth. A search that demanded one thing above all else: a willingness to question everything. Investigators began examining the people connected to Patricia's life. Not only those who had been considered suspects before. Everyone. Because decades can change relationships. They can change circumstances. They can change the way people remember events. Someone who seemed unimportant in the original investigation could become significant years later. Someone who was overlooked could suddenly become the missing link. The investigation expanded beyond the apartment where Patricia was found. Detectives looked at the world around her. Her daily routine. Her connections. Her movements. The people who knew where she was. The people who knew when she was alone. Because in many homicide investigations, the answer lies not in what happened after the crime. It lies in what happened before. The moments leading up to the tragedy. The conversations, the encounters, the choices, the opportunities. Every murder has a beginning, and investigators needed to find a moment when Patricia's ordinary life turned into a crime scene. For the community, the renewed attention brought back memories that had been buried for years. Neighbors who had once watched the investigation unfold remembered the fear and confusion that followed the discovery. They remembered the uncertainty, the questions, the feeling that someone responsible for a terrible act was still out there. An unsolved murder changes a community. Even after decades, the impact remains. Because people do not only fear the crime itself, they fear the unknown. They fear the possibility that the truth is closer than they think. For Patricia's loved ones, the passing years brought no real ending. There was no courtroom, no verdict, no moment where someone was held accountable. Only a question that remained unanswered. Why? Why Patricia? Why that apartment? Why that day? And who had taken away her future? Those questions followed them through birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments that should have been filled with memories instead of uncertainty. But the renewed investigation created something that had been missing for years. Hope. Not certainty. Not yet. But hope. The possibility that Patricia's story could finally move forward. That her name could become connected not only with tragedy, but with justice. Investigators knew that solving the case would not be easy. 43 years creates obstacles that cannot be ignored. People pass away. Records disappear. Memories become incomplete. But they also knew something else. A person responsible for murder can run from the investigation. They can avoid questions. They can hide from the public. But they cannot erase what happened. The truth remains somewhere, and the search for it continues. As detectives dug deeper, they began focusing on the evidence that could provide the breakthrough. The physical traces left behind. The information preserved from the original crime scene. The pieces of the puzzle that had remained untouched while the world moved on. Every cold case has a turning point. A moment when the investigation changes direction. A moment when uncertainty begins to transform into answers. For Patricia Beard, that moment was approaching. The case that had spent decades in silence was beginning to speak. And the clues were pointing investigators toward a discovery that would shock everyone who had followed the mystery. Because after all those years, the person connected to Patricia Beard's death was no longer hidden by the darkness of the past. The investigation was moving closer. The questions were becoming sharper. And the truth that had escaped justice for 43 years was finally beginning to surface. The apartment where Patricia Beard died had kept its secrets for decades. But secrets do not remain buried forever. And soon, the world would learn what had really happened behind that closed door. For 43 years, the murder of Patricia Beard remained a haunting reminder that some questions refused to disappear. The world changed around the case. New technology emerged. New generations of investigators took over. Old headlines faded into history. But one fact remained unchanged. Patricia Beard had been killed, and the person responsible had never been held accountable. Until the investigation began to move again. The renewed search for answers brought investigators back to the evidence, back to the records, and back to the details of a crime that had remained frozen for decades. Cold cases often contain a strange contradiction. They are old, but they are never truly finished. Every piece of evidence carries a history. Every document contains a clue. Every unanswered question represents a possibility. And in Patricia Beard's case, investigators believe the answers were still there, hidden somewhere inside the story. The challenge was finding them. As detectives examined the case again, they focused on reconstructing Patricia's final moments. Not through speculation, not through assumptions, but through facts. The timeline, the evidence, the people connected to her life. A murder investigation is built around one central question. What happened? But solving that question requires answering many smaller ones. Who saw Patricia last? Who spoke with her? Who had contact with her before her death? Who had the opportunity to enter her home? Who could have known what was happening inside that apartment? These questions became the foundation of the renewed investigation. Because in a case that had remained unsolved for more than 4 decades, every detail mattered. The investigators knew they were not simply searching for a suspect. They were searching for a connection, a link between the past and the present, a bridge between the crime scene from decades earlier and the evidence available today. As they reviewed the original case, investigators began noticing the challenges faced by detectives during the first investigation. The world was different. Forensic science was not as advanced. Databases were not as extensive. Information that could now be analyzed in minutes once required weeks or months. A clue that seemed impossible to use decades earlier could now become a critical piece of evidence. That was the power of modern investigation. The ability to ask old evidence new questions. And sometimes the evidence finally answers. The renewed investigation also brought attention back to the people connected to Patricia Beard. Cold case detectives often describe these investigations as unfinished conversations. Because someone may have known something. Someone may have seen something. Someone may have carried a secret for years. The passage of time can change people. A person who once remained silent may eventually decide they can no longer stay quiet. A memory that seemed insignificant may suddenly become important. A statement made decades earlier may take on a completely different meaning. Investigators searched for those moments, those changes, those cracks in the wall of silence. Because every unsolved murder depends on one thing: someone, somewhere, knowing the truth. The question was whether that truth would finally come forward. The return of Patricia Beard's case also reopened old wounds. For those who had waited years for answers, the investigation brought both excitement and pain. Hope that justice might finally arrive. Fear that the mystery could remain unsolved forever. The emotional weight of a cold case is difficult to understand unless someone has lived with it. Time does not erase loss. It only changes the way people carry it. For Patricia's family, every year without answers represented another year stolen by uncertainty. Another year without knowing exactly what happened. Another year without accountability. But the renewed investigation represented something different. A possibility. A chance. A final opportunity to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the evidence with a level of detail that was impossible when the crime first occurred. They looked at the case not as a forgotten tragedy, but as an active investigation. The passage of time did not make Patricia's death less important. It made the search for justice more urgent. Because every victim deserves answers. Every family deserves the truth. And every crime deserves to be solved. The investigation moved carefully. There were no shortcuts. No assumptions. Only evidence. Only facts. Only the determination to find what had been hidden for so long. Then came a development that changed the direction of the case. A discovery connected to the original evidence began opening a new path. A clue that had existed quietly for decades suddenly became significant. The kind of breakthrough investigators dream about. The kind that can transform a cold case from forgotten file into a living investigation. After 43 years, Patricia Beard's murder was no longer just a mystery from the past. It was becoming a case with a future. The silence that surrounded the crime was beginning to break. And the closer investigators moved toward the truth, the clearer one thing became. Someone had carried the secret of Patricia Beard's death for more than 4 decades. But secrets have a way of surviving only until the moment someone finds the right question. And investigators had finally found it. The case was changing. The investigation was accelerating. And after decades of waiting, Patricia Beard was finally moving closer to justice. For more than 4 decades, The murder of Patricia Beard remained one of those cases that seemed trapped between memory and silence. A crime that happened in another era. A mystery that survived long after the original headlines disappeared. A question that continued to follow everyone connected to it. Who killed Patricia Beard? And why did the truth remain hidden for so long? But every cold case has a moment when the past begins to collide with the present. For Patricia Beard, that moment came when investigators discovered that the answers they had been searching for might not be buried at all. They might have been waiting inside the evidence. The investigation entered a new phase. Detectives began taking another careful look at the information collected decades earlier. They examined the original reports. They reviewed the timeline. They compared old statements with new information. They searched for inconsistencies. They searched for connections. Because after 43 years, solving the case would require more than simply finding evidence. It would require understanding the story behind that evidence. Every murder leaves behind two stories. The story people see, and the story hidden beneath the surface. The visible story was simple. A woman was found dead inside her apartment. A community was shocked. Investigators responded. A murder investigation began. But the hidden story was far more complicated. It involved relationships, secrets, possible motives, and the unknown actions of the person responsible. The task facing investigators was to separate facts from assumptions, to look beyond what had been believed for decades, and to ask a question that can change any cold case. What if the original picture was incomplete? That question has solved countless mysteries, because investigations are created by human beings, and human beings can make mistakes. They can overlook details. They can follow one path while another remains hidden. Not because they do not care, not because they do not work hard, but because every investigation is limited by the information available at the time. Decades later, investigators had something their predecessors did not. Perspective. They could look back at the entire history of the case. They could see where the investigation slowed, where questions remained unanswered, where possibilities were never fully explored. And with new technology, they could examine evidence in ways that were impossible when Patricia Beard's death first shocked the community. The evidence became the center of attention. Because physical evidence has one powerful quality. It does not change its story. People forget. People misunderstand. People sometimes lie. But evidence remains. And after decades of silence, investigators believe the evidence still had something to reveal. The process was slow, careful, precise. Every detail mattered. Every discovery had to be verified. Every possibility had to be tested. Because in a case this old, investigators could not afford to chase rumors. They needed facts. The renewed investigation also brought a new reality. The world had changed since Patricia's death. Technology had changed. People had changed. But the person responsible had also changed. A suspect from decades earlier would no longer be the same person today. They may have grown older. They may have built a different life. They may have believed the past was permanently buried. But investigators understood something important. Time does not erase responsibility. A person can move forward. A person can change their appearance. A person can leave behind the place where a crime happened. But they cannot escape what they did. And that possibility became increasingly important as investigators continued their work. The case was no longer only about what happened in Patricia's apartment. It was about finding the person who had carried that secret for 43 years. Someone who had lived through decades knowing the truth. Someone who had watched the investigation fade away. Someone who may have believed they would never be discovered. the renewed attention also affected the community that had lived with the mystery. For years, Patricia Beard's murder represented an unanswered fear, a reminder that some crimes remain unresolved. But now, that fear was being replaced by anticipation. Could this finally be the moment? Could the case finally be solved? Could Patricia's family finally receive the answers they had waited for? Those questions surrounded the investigation as detectives moved closer to a breakthrough. The evidence that once seemed silent was beginning to tell a story that connected past and present, a story that revealed new possibilities, a story that brought investigators closer to the person responsible. But solving a cold case is not only about discovering who committed the crime. It is also about understanding why. The motive, the decision, the moment when a person chooses violence. For Patricia Beard, that question remained one of the greatest mysteries. What happened inside that apartment? What led to her death? What caused someone to end her life and disappear into history? Those questions had remained unanswered for 43 years. But now, investigators were closer than ever. The case was no longer fading into the past. It was moving toward a conclusion built from patience, technology, determination, and the evidence that had survived when everything else had changed. The person responsible for Patricia Beard's death had spent decades believing the secret was safe. But every secret leaves a trace. Every crime leaves a mark. And after 43 years, the past was finally catching up. The investigation was approaching the moment everyone had waited for. The moment when a cold case becomes a solved case. The moment when a name is revealed. The moment when a family finally hears the truth. And the moment when Patricia Beard's story, silent for more than 4 decades, would finally be heard. For 43 years, Patricia Beard's murder remained a question without an answer. A case that haunted investigators. A tragedy that left a family waiting. A mystery that became part of the history of unsolved crimes. But behind every cold case is a moment when the silence begins to break. And for Patricia Beard, that moment came when investigators uncovered the importance of evidence that had survived decades of uncertainty. The case was no longer only a story from the past. It was becoming an active investigation once again. A search for truth. A search for justice. A search for the person who had remained hidden for more than 4 decades. Cold case investigations often depend on patience. They require detectives to revisit information that may have been examined many times before. They require the ability to look at old facts with new eyes. Because sometimes the answer is not hidden in a new discovery. Sometimes it is hidden in something that was always there. The investigators working on Patricia Beard's case understood this. They knew that somewhere inside the evidence, the original investigation, or the forgotten details of the past, there could be the missing connection. The key was finding it. The process was painstaking. Old documents were reviewed. Previous interviews were analyzed. The timeline was reconstructed. Every piece of information was compared against what investigators now knew. The goal was simple. Find what had been missed. Find what had been overlooked. Find what could finally explain what happened inside Patricia Beard's apartment. As the investigation moved forward, attention focused on the people who existed within Patricia's world. The people who knew her. The people who interacted with her. The people who may have had information that was never fully explored. Because in many murder cases, the answer is not found in a random stranger. It is found somewhere within the victim's circle. Someone who knew their routine. Someone who understood their life. Someone who had access. That possibility made the investigation even more intense. Because the person responsible may not have been a distant figure. They may have been someone who had been close enough to enter Patricia's life, close enough to know where she was, close enough to know when she was vulnerable, and close enough to leave behind a secret that lasted for decades. Investigators also understood the psychological side of cold cases. A person who commits a murder and avoids arrest for years often begins to believe they have escaped. They see the headlines disappear. They see the public lose interest. They watch the investigation slow down. Eventually, they may convince themselves that the danger has passed. But law enforcement sees these cases differently. A cold case is not a closed case. It is an unfinished investigation. And every year brings new opportunities, new technology, new information, new chances for the truth to emerge. The murder of Patricia Beard became an example of how time can change an investigation. The detectives who first worked the case had done everything possible with the tools they had. But decades later, investigators had a new advantage. They could combine old evidence with modern science. They could search wider. They could compare more information. They could uncover connections that were invisible before. The past and present were finally coming together. For Patricia's family, the renewed investigation carried emotions that were difficult to describe. After so many years, hope could be painful. Because hope means believing again. And believing again means risking disappointment. For decades, they had lived without the answers that every family deserves. They had carried questions that never disappeared. They had waited for a moment that many people believed might never come. But now that moment seemed possible. The investigation was moving. The evidence was speaking. And the mystery surrounding Patricia Beard's death was beginning to unravel. The community that once lived with uncertainty began watching closely. A case that had once faded from public attention was returning. The story was no longer only about a crime from the past. It was about accountability, about whether justice could still be achieved after so much time had passed. Because one of the most powerful questions in any cold case is this: how long can someone hide from the truth? 10 years? 20 years? 43 years? Investigators believe the answer was simple. No amount of time can erase a crime. No amount of distance can remove responsibility. And no amount of silence can guarantee that the truth will never be found. As the investigation continued, the focus became sharper. The evidence was leading investigators toward a clearer picture of what had happened. The unanswered questions that had surrounded Patricia Beard's death were finally beginning to receive answers. The mystery that had lasted longer than anyone imagined was approaching its final chapter. But even as investigators moved closer, one question remained. Who had been responsible all along? Who had walked away from that apartment and carried the secret for 43 years? Who had allowed Patricia Beard's name to remain connected with uncertainty for so long? The answer was closer than ever. And when it finally emerged, it would change everything people thought they knew about the case. Because after decades of silence, the truth was no longer hidden. It was waiting, and the world was about to learn what really happened to Patricia Beard. For 43 years, the murder of Patricia Beard remained frozen in time. A crime scene that existed only in old photographs. A name preserved in forgotten records. A mystery that continued to follow those who refused to stop searching. But every cold case has a moment when the past finally catches up with the present. And for Patricia Beard, that moment came when investigators uncovered the evidence that would transform the entire investigation. After decades of uncertainty, the case was no longer moving through shadows. It was moving toward an answer. The process was not sudden. It was not simple. Solving a murder after 43 years requires more than determination. It requires precision. Every detail must be examined. Every discovery must be confirmed. Every possibility must be carefully considered. Because when justice has been delayed for decades, there is no room for mistakes. Investigators returned again and again to the evidence. They studied what had been collected. They studied what had been recorded. They studied what had been forgotten. The smallest details became the most important. A trace left behind. A connection from a past. A piece of information that suddenly made sense. Cold case investigations often depend on these moments. The moment when something that once appeared meaningless becomes impossible to ignore. For Patricia Beard's case, investigators began seeing the evidence differently. Not as pieces from an old investigation, but as pieces of a story that had never been fully understood. The story of what happened inside that apartment. The story of how Patricia's life ended. And the story of who had been responsible. The investigation also required looking at the passage of time itself. 43 years had created distance between the crime and the search for justice. But that distance did not erase the connection. The people involved had changed. The world had changed. But the facts remained. A woman had been killed. A family had been left without answers. And someone had escaped accountability. Until now, investigators knew that solving the case would require identifying the person who had remained hidden behind decades of silence. Someone who had lived with the knowledge of the crime. Someone who had watched as the case grew colder. Someone who may have believed that the passage of time had become their protection. But time can be unpredictable. The same years that create distance can also create opportunities. A person may move away. A person may change their life. A person may believe they are safe. But evidence can wait. And when the right moment arrives, evidence can speak louder than anyone expected. The breakthrough in Patricia Beard's case changed the direction of the investigation. Suddenly, detectives were no longer searching through endless possibilities. They were following a path created by facts, a path that led back to the person connected to the crime. The case that had once seemed impossible was becoming clear. The questions that had remained unanswered for decades were finally being addressed. But for investigators, identifying a suspect was only the beginning. A successful investigation requires more than suspicion. It requires proof. It requires evidence strong enough to stand in court. It requires building a case that can explain not only who was responsible, but how the crime happened. And that meant returning once again to the timeline. The final moments of Patricia Beard's life. The events leading up to her death. The actions of the person who entered her world. The decisions that led to a tragedy that lasted far beyond that single day. Every murder investigation is ultimately about choices. Someone made a choice. Someone crossed a line. Someone changed the course of another person's life forever. For Patricia Beard, that choice created 43 years of pain and unanswered questions. But now, investigators were closer to revealing the person behind that choice. The renewed attention on the case also brought a powerful message to other families of victims. That no case is truly forgotten. That evidence can survive. That justice can arrive even after decades. The murder of Patricia Beard represented everything that makes cold cases so haunting. A victim whose story remained unfinished. A family waiting for answers. A community searching for peace. And a truth hidden beneath years of silence. But the silence was ending. The investigation had reached a point where the past could no longer remain buried. The person responsible was no longer just a name missing from a file. They were becoming real. The evidence was creating a picture. The timeline was becoming clearer. And the mystery that had surrounded Patricia Beard's death for 43 years was finally beginning to disappear. The apartment where Patricia was found had once been a place of unanswered questions, a place where investigators searched for clues that seemed impossible to find. But now, that same case scene had become the foundation for the truth. Because even after all those years, the evidence had survived, and it was ready to reveal what happened. The final chapter of Patricia Beard's story was approaching. A chapter that would bring answers. A chapter that would bring accountability. A chapter that would finally explain how a murder that remained unsolved for more than 4 decades was finally brought back into the light. After 43 years, the mystery was breaking apart, and the truth was finally coming home. For 43 years, Patricia Beard's murder remained a wound that never fully healed. A case that refused to disappear. A mystery that survived through generations. A story of unanswered questions, fading memories, and a family that waited for a truth that seemed impossible to find. But after decades of silence, the investigation reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when a cold case finally began to reveal its secrets. The evidence that had remained silent for years was now speaking. The questions that had haunted investigators were finally being answered. And the person responsible for Patricia Beard's death was no longer hidden behind the passage of time. The breakthrough did not come from a single dramatic moment. It came from persistence, from investigators willing to reopen old files, from technology that allowed the past to be examined in new ways, from evidence that had survived longer than anyone expected. The case was a reminder of one of the most important principles in criminal investigations. Time may slow justice, but time does not erase it. For decades, Patricia Beard's murder represented uncertainty. But the renewed investigation transformed uncertainty into possibility. Every piece of evidence became part of a larger picture. Every detail became part of timeline. Every discovery moved investigators closer to understanding what had happened inside that apartment. The investigation eventually reached the point where suspicion became something stronger. A connection. A link between the evidence and the person responsible. The case that had remained unsolved for more than 4 decades finally had direction. But even after identifying the person connected to the crime, investigators still faced the responsibility of proving what happened. Because justice requires more than answers. It requires accountability. It requires a complete understanding of the events that took Patricia Beard's life. The final moments. The motive. The actions that followed. The investigation carefully examined the evidence and reconstructed the events surrounding Patricia's death. A story that had remained incomplete for decades was finally being written. And at the center of that story was the truth Patricia's family had waited so long to hear. For those who had followed the case, the developments were shocking. A mystery that many believed would remain unsolved forever was finally reaching a conclusion. The headlines that once reported uncertainty were replaced by headlines of answers. A cold case had become a solved case. A forgotten investigation had returned to national attention. And a woman whose name had been connected to tragedy for 43 years was finally connected to justice. The impact of solving an old murder extends far beyond the courtroom. For families, it changes everything. The questions that have followed them for years finally have answers. The endless wondering finally comes to an end. The uncertainty that shaped their lives finally begins to disappear. No conviction or investigation can bring back the person they lost. But knowing the truth provides something that uncertainty never could. A sense of completion. For Patricia Beard's family, the resolution represented the end of a decades-long wait. A wait filled with pain. A wait filled with memories. A wait filled with the hope that one day someone would finally uncover what happened. The community that had lived with the mystery also experienced a powerful moment. A crime that had once created fear and confusion now had an explanation. The unanswered questions that had followed the neighborhood for decades were finally gone. The silence had been broken, and the case that once represented everything frightening about unsolved crimes became an example of something else. The possibility of justice. Because Patricia Beard's story demonstrates a reality that investigators repeat again and again. Cold cases are never truly cold. They are only waiting. Waiting for new technology. Waiting for new investigators. Waiting for one discovery that changes everything. The evidence connected to Patricia's murder survived because the search for justice never stopped. Even after years passed. Even after public attention faded. Even after the case became a memory for many people. There were still people searching. Still people asking questions. Still people refusing to accept that the truth would never be known. And that determination finally made the difference. The person responsible could not hide forever. The secret that had lasted for 43 years was finally exposed. The investigation that began with tragedy ended with answers. But the story of Patricia Beard remained more than just a criminal case. It became a reminder of the lives behind every headline. Behind every investigation file is a person. A person with dreams. A person with relationships. A person whose future was taken away. Patricia Beard was not just a victim in a cold case. She was a woman whose life mattered. A woman whose story deserved to be completed. And after more than 4 decades, her story was finally heard. The apartment where she was found no longer represented only mystery. It represented the power of persistence. The belief that truth can survive. The belief that justice can still arrive, even after years of silence. Because some cases challenge investigators. Some cases test families. Some cases seem impossible. But every once in a while, a case that everyone thought would remain unanswered proves something important. The past is never completely gone. The evidence is never truly silent. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, has a way of finding its way back into the light. After 43 years, Patricia Beard's name was no longer attached only to a mystery. It was attached to an answer. And for the first time in decades, the final chapter of her story could finally begin. After 43 years of silence, the name Patricia Beard finally returned to the place where every victim deserves to be. Not forgotten, not abandoned, but remembered. For decades, her murder represented everything terrifying about an unsolved case. A life suddenly taken. A family left searching for answers. A community forced to live with uncertainty. A mystery that seemed frozen in time. But the passage of years did not erase Patricia's story. It only delayed the moment when the truth would finally emerge. The investigation that began with confusion and unanswered questions became a powerful reminder that no crime disappears completely. No matter how much time passes, no matter how many years separate the crime from the investigation, there are always traces. There are always questions. And there is always a possibility that justice can still find its way forward. The story of Patricia Beard was never only about the person responsible for her death. It was about the woman herself. A person whose life existed beyond the headlines. Beyond the police reports. Beyond the photographs connected to a decades-old investigation. She was someone with memories. Someone with relationships. Someone whose future was taken away in a moment of violence. And for the people who loved her, the search for answers was never simply about solving a crime. It was about honoring her life. For 43 years, uncertainty surrounded Patricia's name. Every unanswered question carried weight. The name Patricia Beard had once represented a question. A question written in old case files. A question repeated by investigators who refused to forget. A question carried by a family that waited decades for an answer. But every mystery has a moment when the silence begins to weaken. And after 43 years, the story of Patricia Beard reached that moment. The investigation that had remained dormant for so long became a reminder of one undeniable truth. A case may become cold, but a victim's story never disappears. Behind every piece of evidence is a human life. Behind every investigation report is a family searching for peace. And behind every unanswered question is the possibility that one day the truth will finally emerge. For years, Patricia Beard's murder existed in the space between memory and uncertainty. People remembered the tragedy. They remembered the shock. They remembered the fear that followed. But they did not have the one thing everyone wanted: answers. The passage of time created distance, but it never removed the importance of what happened. Because time does not change the value of justice. A crime committed decades ago is still a crime. A victim forgotten by the public is still a victim. And a family waiting for the truth is still waiting. That understanding became the foundation of the renewed investigation. The search was not only about solving an old murder. It was about restoring a story that had remained incomplete for too long. Investigators knew that every cold case carries a hidden challenge. The evidence may exist. The answers may exist. But they are often buried beneath years of assumptions. The first investigation creates a path. But sometimes, decades later, investigators discover that another path was waiting all along. A different perspective. A different question. A different way of seeing the same evidence. That is what makes cold cases so fascinating and so difficult. The past cannot be changed, but the way we understand the past can. The investigators who returned to Patricia Beard's case understood they were not simply reopening a file. They were reopening a story filled with unanswered moments. A story that began with an ordinary life. A story that ended with tragedy. And a story that remained unfinished for more than 4 decades. The search for justice required patience. It required attention to details that others might overlook. Because in an old case, the smallest discovery can become the most important. A forgotten record. A connection between names. A piece of evidence that gains new meaning. A memory that returns after years of silence. Every cold case solved begins with someone willing to look again. To ask again, to search again. And that determination became the force driving the investigation forward. The world around Patricia Beard had changed dramatically. Technology had advanced. Investigative methods had evolved. The way detectives approached evidence had transformed. But the central question remained exactly the same. Who was responsible? That question had followed the case from the beginning. It had followed investigators. It had followed the community. It had followed everyone who believed Patricia deserved justice. And after decades, that question was finally closer to an answer. The investigation revealed something important about the nature of time. Many people believe time protects those who commit crimes. They believe that memories disappear. They believe evidence loses its value. They believe the world eventually moves on. But history has proven something different. Time can expose what was hidden. Time can create new opportunities. Time can bring new technology. Time can give investigators the ability to see what was invisible before. The person responsible for Patricia Beard's death may have believed that the years were working in their favor. But every passing year also meant another year of possibility for investigators. Another year for science to advance. Another year for the truth to survive. The case became more than an investigation. It became a symbol of perseverance. A reminder that justice is not measured by speed. It is measured by commitment. For the family connected to Patricia Beard, the resolution represented more than a legal outcome. It represented recognition. Recognition that her life mattered. Recognition that her death mattered. Recognition that she had not been forgotten. Because one of the deepest fears in any unsolved case is the fear that the victim's story will disappear. That the person behind the headline will become just another name. But Patricia Beard's story survived. It survived because people continued asking questions. It survived because investigators continued searching. It survived because the truth, even when delayed, still had a way of returning. The apartment where Patricia Beard was found remained the center of a mystery for decades. A place where investigators searched for answers. A place connected forever to a tragic moment. But after years of uncertainty, that location became something else. A reminder that even the darkest cases can eventually move toward the light. Because justice is not only about punishment. It is about truth. It is about understanding what happened. It is about giving a victim back the story that was taken from them. And after 43 years, Patricia Beard's story was no longer only about a crime. It was about resilience. It was about the investigators who refused to stop. It was about a family that refused to forget. It was about a community that continued waiting. And it was about the power of evidence that survived longer than anyone expected. The mystery that once seemed permanent began to disappear. The questions that once had no answers began to find their place. The silence that surrounded Patricia Beard for decades was finally broken. But the impact of the case would continue. Because every solved cold case sends a message. To families still waiting. To investigators still searching. To communities still hoping. The message is simple. A case is never truly over. A victim is never truly forgotten. And the truth, no matter how far it travels into the past, can still find its way home. For decades, Patricia Beard's name existed as a reminder of a mystery that refused to disappear. A case that remained open. A story without an ending. A question that echoed through years of silence. But every investigation has a moment when the past begins to reveal what it has been hiding. And for Patricia Beard, that moment represented something far greater than the closing of a case. It represented the return of a voice that had been silent for far too long. Because behind every cold case is more than evidence. More than reports. More than dates and locations. There's a person. There's a life. There's a family waiting for answers. And there is a truth that deserves to be uncovered. The investigation into Patricia Beard's death became a powerful example of how time can change everything while changing nothing at all. The world around the case continued moving forward. Technology advanced. Cities changed. People grew older. New generations came and went. But the questions surrounding Patricia remained exactly where they had always been. What happened inside that apartment? Who was responsible? Why did the truth remain hidden for so many years? Those questions became the foundation of the search. Investigators understood that solving an old case required more than simply reviewing the past. They had to challenge it. They had to examine every assumption, every conclusion, every detail that had once seemed unimportant. Because history has shown that the difference between an unsolved case and a solved case can sometimes be one overlooked detail. One piece of information. One connection waiting to be discovered. Cold case investigators often describe their work as rebuilding a puzzle after the pieces have been scattered for years. The picture is still there, but it is hidden. The challenge is finding where each piece belongs. For Patricia Beard's investigation, the search required patience and determination. There were no easy answers. No simple explanations. Only a long process of discovery. The evidence had to be examined carefully. The timeline had to be reconstructed. The story of Patricia's final moments had to be understood. Because the truth of a murder is not found only in what happened. It is found in why it happened. Every action has a reason. Every decision has a moment. Every crime has a beginning. Investigators searched for that beginning. The moment when an ordinary day became a tragedy. The moment when someone made a choice that changed multiple lives forever. For years, the person responsible had lived with the knowledge of what happened. They had carried a secret that survived through decades. They had watched the world move on. They had watched the case become a memory. But what they did not know was that the investigation was never truly gone. It was waiting for the right technology, waiting for the right questions, waiting for the moment when the past could finally be understood. That is the power of cold case investigations. They remind people that time does not always create distance. Sometimes, time creates opportunities. A witness may remember something important. A new method may reveal hidden information. A forgotten detail may suddenly become the center of the investigation. The impossible can become possible. The unknown can become known. And the silent can finally speak. The return of Patricia Beard's case also carried a deeper emotional impact. For years, those connected to her lived without certainty. They lived with questions that had no answers. They lived with the pain of knowing that someone responsible had never been identified. The absence of justice creates a unique kind of suffering. It leaves families suspended between the past and the present, unable to move forward completely, unable to leave the tragedy behind. Because closure does not come from forgetting. Closure comes from knowing. Knowing what happened. Knowing why it happened. Knowing that the truth has finally been recognized. That is why solving a cold case matters. It is not only about the person who committed the crime. It is about the person whose life was taken. It is about restoring dignity to someone who can no longer speak for themselves. Patricia Beard's story became a reminder that victims are never just names in a report. They are people. People who had dreams. People who had memories. People who mattered. And even decades later, their stories still matter. As investigators continued uncovering the truth, the mystery that had surrounded Patricia Beard's death began to lose its power. The uncertainty that had controlled the story for years began to disappear. The unanswered questions that once seemed impossible began finding answers. The case that represented frustration became a symbol of persistence. A symbol that justice can survive time. Because justice is not limited by calendar. It does not expire because years have passed. It does not become less important because the world has moved on. For 43 years, Patricia Beard's case waited for the truth. And when that truth finally emerged, it proved something investigators have always believed. No matter how carefully someone hides, no matter how long they wait, no matter how many years pass, the past has a way of returning. The evidence remains. The questions remain. And eventually, the truth finds a way to be heard. Patricia Beard's story was no longer only a story about a crime that happened decades ago. It became a story about perseverance, about determination, about the people who refused to stop searching, and about a truth that waited 43 years before finally stepping into the light. Because some mysteries are not forgotten. They're simply waiting for their final answer. The longest investigations are not always measured by the number of pages inside a case file. They're measured by the years people spend waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for justice. Waiting for the moment when a name, once connected only to mystery, can finally be connected to the truth. For 43 years, Patricia Beard's story remained trapped inside that waiting. A story surrounded by uncertainty. A story followed by questions. A story that refused to disappear, even when time tried to bury it. But the passage of time did not erase what happened. It only delayed the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. The investigation into Patricia Beard's death became a powerful reminder that every cold case carries two battles. The battle to uncover what happened, and the battle to make sure the victim is never forgotten. Because when a murder remains unsolved, the crime does not end. It continues through every unanswered question, every anniversary, every moment when a family wonders what they still do not know. That is the invisible weight of a cold case. The world may move forward. The headlines may disappear. But for those closest to the victim, the search never truly ends. Patricia Beard's case carried that weight for more than 4 decades. But the determination to find the truth never disappeared. Investigators returned to the case with a different understanding. They were not simply looking at an old crime. They were looking at a story that had been interrupted, a story that deserved an ending. The process required patience. It required examining information that had been reviewed before. It required asking questions that had already been asked. But sometimes the most important discoveries come from looking again. A detail ignored years earlier can become the key. A piece of evidence stored away can become the turning point. A connection that once seemed impossible can suddenly become clear. That is what makes cold case investigations so remarkable. They prove that the truth does not have an expiration date. It can wait. It can survive. It can remain hidden until the right moment arrives. The investigation into Patricia Beard's murder also revealed something about the nature of justice. Justice is often imagined as something immediate. A crime happens. An investigation begins. A suspect is found. A case is resolved. But reality is not always that simple. Sometimes justice takes years. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes the people searching for answers must continue long after others have moved on. That persistence is what keeps cold cases alive. Is what gives families hope. Is what gives victims a chance to have their stories heard again. For Patricia Beard, that persistence became the reason her case continued. Her name remained in records. Her story remained remembered. Her death remained important. Because every victim deserves more than a headline. They deserve to be known. They deserve to be remembered as a person, not just as part of crime. Behind the investigation was a woman whose life existed before the tragedy. A woman who had relationships. A woman who had experiences. A woman whose future should have continued. The person responsible for ending that future created a mystery that lasted for decades. But they could not erase who Patricia was. They could not erase the impact of her life. And they could not erase the determination of those searching for the truth. As the investigation progressed, the case became a symbol for other families facing similar situations. Families who still wait. Families who still ask questions. Families who still hope that one day someone will look again. Because every cold case carries the possibility of a breakthrough. Every piece of evidence carries a possibility. Every unanswered question carries the potential for an answer. The story of Patricia Beard proved that time is not always an obstacle. Sometimes, time becomes the path. The years allowed technology to advance. They allowed investigators to gain new perspectives. They allowed old evidence to reveal information that was impossible to uncover before. The past and present finally connected, and the mystery that had surrounded Patricia Beard's death began to disappear. The apartment where Patricia was found had once represented fear, a place connected to tragedy, a place where a life ended and questions began. But decades later, the meaning of that place changed. It became a reminder of something more powerful, that even the darkest mysteries can eventually be challenged, that even the oldest cases can still move forward, that even after 43 years, justice can still arrive. The conclusion of Patricia Beard's case carried a message that reached far beyond one investigation. It showed that no victim should ever be considered forgotten. No case should be considered impossible. And no amount of time should convince people to stop searching. Because every crime leaves behind something. A memory. A question. A piece of evidence. And sometimes, that one remaining piece is enough to reveal everything. The story of Patricia Beard's murder began with tragedy. It continued through uncertainty. It survived decades of silence. But it ended with the truth finally emerging. A truth that had waited patiently. A truth that had survived every obstacle. A truth that proved one of the strongest beliefs in criminal investigation. The past never truly disappears. It waits. It remains. And eventually, it speaks. After 43 years, Patricia Beard's story finally reached the moment it had been waiting for. The moment when mystery became understanding. The moment when silence became answers. The moment when a cold case became a reminder that justice, no matter how delayed, can still find its way home. Some stories disappear with time. Some names fade from memory. Some tragedies become nothing more than a forgotten headline buried beneath decades of new events. But some stories refuse to disappear. Some names continue to be remembered because behind them is a question that demands an answer. Patricia Beard was one of those names. For 43 years, her story remained unfinished. A mystery surrounded by silence. A case marked by uncertainty. A search for justice that continued long after many believed the answers might never come. But the passage of time did not end the investigation. It only changed the way the truth would eventually be found. Every cold case carries a unique kind of power. It is a reminder that the past is never completely gone. The people may change. The world may change. The technology may change. But the evidence remains. The questions remain. And the need for justice remains. The investigation into Patricia Beard's death became more than a search for a suspect. It became a search for meaning. A search to understand what happened inside those final moments. A search to restore the truth to a story that had remained incomplete for decades. Investigators who dedicate their lives to cold cases understand one important reality. The absence of answers does not mean there are no answers. Sometimes the truth is simply waiting for the right moment. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. Waiting for someone to examine the evidence one more time. Waiting for the technology and determination needed to uncover what has been hidden. That belief is what keeps cold cases alive. It is what brings investigators back to old files, back to forgotten evidence, back to mysteries that others believed were impossible to solve. The case of Patricia Beard represented that challenge. A crime from another era. A mystery that survived through generations. A question that remained unanswered for longer than anyone expected. But investigators refused to accept that the truth was gone. Because every victim leaves behind a story. And every story deserves to be told completely. The years following Patricia's death were filled with uncertainty. For those who cared about her, time did not create distance from the tragedy. It created more questions. More moments wondering what could have been different. More moments imagining the answers that never came. An unsolved murder creates a special kind of pain. There is grief. But there is also uncertainty. There is loss. But there is also the unanswered question of why. Why did this happen? Why was Patricia targeted? Why did the person responsible remain hidden for so long? Those questions followed the case through decades. But the search for answers continued because Patricia's life mattered. Her story mattered. And justice mattered. The investigators who reopened the case understood that solving an old crime requires looking beyond the obvious. They had to examine the details that had survived. They had to separate facts from assumptions. They had to rebuild the timeline and understand the events that led to the tragedy. A cold case is often like a photograph damaged by time. The image is still there, but parts of it are unclear. The investigator's job is to restore that image, to bring the hidden details back into focus, to reveal what was always present. The investigation into Patricia Beard's murder showed the importance of persistence. Because every solved cold case begins with someone refusing to give up. Someone believing that the victim still deserves answers. Someone believing that the truth is still possible. That belief can transform an old file into a living investigation. It can turn forgotten evidence into a breakthrough. It can turn years of silence into a moment of revelation. The story of Patricia Beard also carries a message for the families of other victims. Families who continue waiting. Families who continue searching. Families who wonder whether anyone still remembers. They should know that a case does not lose importance because time passes. A victim does not become less valuable because years go by. And justice does not become less necessary because the calendar changes. The truth does not belong only to the moment when a crime happens. The truth belongs to everyone affected by that crime. It belongs to the victim. It belongs to the family. It belongs to the community. And it belongs to the investigators who continue searching. Patricia Beard's case became a reminder that even the longest silence can be broken. That even the most difficult questions can eventually find answers. That even after decades, justice can still move forward. Because the most important part of any investigation is not the amount of time that has passed. It is the determination to keep searching. The apartment where Patricia Beard was found once represented only tragedy. A place connected to fear and unanswered questions. But after decades of investigation, that same story became something different. It became a symbol of hope, a symbol of persistence, a symbol that no victim should ever be forgotten. The truth surrounding Patricia Beard's death survived because people continued to look, because investigators continued to ask questions, because evidence continued to exist, and because justice refused to disappear. In the end, every cold case is about more than solving a crime. It is about giving a voice back to someone who lost theirs. It is about recognizing a life that was taken too soon. It is about proving that the passage of time cannot erase the importance of truth. Patricia Beard's name remained for 43 years because her story was never finished. And when the final pieces finally came together, they revealed something powerful. The truth can be delayed. The investigation can take decades. The answers can come later than anyone hoped. But justice can still arrive. Because some mysteries are not forgotten. They are waiting. Waiting for the evidence. Waiting for the moment. Waiting for the truth to finally be heard. Every passing year brought another reminder that the person responsible had not been held accountable. But the resolution of the case changed the meaning of those years. The silence was replaced with truth. The questions were replaced with answers. The fear was replaced with understanding. Cold cases often leave behind a unique kind of pain. A normal criminal case has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There is an investigation. There is a trial. There is a conclusion. But when a case remains unsolved, the story feels unfinished. The victim remains trapped in the moment when everything changed. The family remains trapped between hope and disappointment. The community remains trapped between memory and uncertainty. That is why solving a cold case matters. It does not change the past. It cannot undo the tragedy. But it restores something that was lost. The truth. And sometimes, the truth is the most important thing left. The investigation into Patricia Beard's murder showed the power of persistence. The detectives who returned to the case years later understood that old evidence can still hold new answers. They understood that technology can reveal what previous generations could not. They understood that every victim deserves the same commitment, whether the crime happened yesterday or more than 4 decades ago. Because justice does not have an expiration date. The person responsible for Patricia Beard's death may have believed that time would protect them, that memories would disappear, that the investigation would become nothing more than an old file stored away in a forgotten archive. But time became the very thing that exposed the truth. The years did not erase the evidence. They did not erase the questions. They did not erase Patricia's name. Instead, those years created the distance investigators needed to return with new methods and a new perspective. The case became a reminder that even the most difficult mysteries can eventually be solved. Not always quickly, not always easily, but sometimes, after decades of searching, the truth finally appears. The apartment where Patricia Beard's life ended once represented uncertainty. A place filled with questions. A place where investigators searched for answers that seemed impossible to find. But decades later, that same case became a symbol of something different. Hope. Hope for families who continue waiting. Hope for investigators who refuse to give up. Hope that every victim, no matter how much time has passed, can still receive justice. The story of Patricia Beard is also a warning. A warning that crimes leave behind evidence. A warning that secrets become heavier with time. A warning that even the longest silence can eventually be broken. Because every action leaves a mark. Every decision has consequences. And every mystery has a moment when the truth comes forward. For 43 years, Patricia Beard's story waited. It waited through changing generations. It waited through changing technology. It waited through years when many believed the answers might never come. But the story was never truly over. The final chapter was still being written. And now, after decades of uncertainty, Patricia Beard's name stands not only as a reminder of a tragic crime, but as a reminder of the power of justice. A woman who was once remembered only through an unsolved mystery was finally remembered through the truth. A case that once represented frustration became a lesson in determination. A cold case that seemed impossible became proof that no investigation is ever truly finished. Because somewhere, hidden beneath the years, beneath the silence, beneath the forgotten memories, the truth remained. And when the time finally came, it was revealed. The mystery of Patricia Beard's death no longer belonged only to the past. It became a story of perseverance. A story of justice delayed but not denied. A story that proves one powerful truth. Time can hide a crime, but time cannot hide the truth forever. And after 43 years, the final unanswered questions surrounding Patricia Beard's death finally had their answer.